Hello. In this unit and the next, we're going to be applying some of the discussions of ethics that we've had in the last couple of units to the issue of abortion. So I hope that we can take a calm approach here. It's a heated issue. Understandably, it's very important. I hope that we can, and I guess I should say also, for some of us, it's a very personal issue. And if that's going to be an issue for you, be a challenge for you in this material, I understand that, and if you can let me know if you want to. Of course, you don't need to. But so I'd like us to, as much as possible in discussing this issue, to be as calm and cool as we can, not because the issues are unimportant, but exactly because they are, and I think that they can best be addressed when we're cooler and calmer about them. If you do feel yourself getting heated, you might wonder or consider, if you're right, then do you need to get heated? And if you're not right, then getting heated is probably a mistake. And so either way, it may not be helpful. So that's the way I'll be approaching this issue in any case, and I hope that you join me. So I'm going to talk in this video about some background to the issue. So facts about pregnancy, facts about how abortion works, a little bit facts about the law and as it stands and as it might stand, and then in the and a little bit about framing the ethical issues. In the rest of the videos in this module, we'll be looking at an ethically pro-life position, and in the videos and reading in the next module, we'll be looking at an ethically pro-choice position. Okay, so about pregnancy. So have a sperm and an ovum, an egg. The sperm fertilizes the egg. This creates a zygote. What is it? Which is a name for a cell whose DNA is a combination of the sperms and the egg. So there's a combination of the DNA once the sperm has fertilized the egg. And the zygote is the first stage of the embryo. So after about 24 to 36 hours, the zygote starts dividing, and it continues to grow and differentiate, so that it's not just all cells that are exactly the same, but the cells start to differ from one another. After about 8 to 10 days after initial fertilization, the embryo then finally implants in the wall of the uterus, and the growth and differentiation continue. When we get to the 8th week after fertilization, every organ or a precursor of the organ is present. So there's something that, if it's not the organ, will turn into each organ in the completed human body. And at this point, we say that the embryo has become a fetus. There's some awkward terminology here. I'm not aware of any word that applies to both embryos and fetuses and zygotes. There's no word for sort of thing that was sort of post-fertilization up to birth. I'm not aware of one word that covers all of those stages. So given current medicine, the fetus can first survive outside of the mother's womb after about 24 weeks, that's about 6 weeks after, or 6 months after fertilization, and at that point the fetus is said to be viable. Given our best understanding of how the brain and the mind work, however, the fetus doesn't feel pain until substantially later, so 29 or 30 weeks, and that's in the middle of the 8th month after fertilization. So that's very late in the pregnancy, because birth tends to occur around 40 weeks, sometimes a little bit earlier, sometimes a little bit later. Okay, so we're not going to worry about viability, exactly when that is, and we're not going to worry about how we use the word conception. Sometimes that's used to refer to the point in which the egg has been fertilized. Sometimes it's used to refer to some point after that where there's the zygote is formed, or sometimes a little bit later after implantation. We're not going to worry about that. Okay, so abortion. So just some numbers. About 1/4 of women have had an abortion by the age of 45. That's from Planned Parenthood, which is a women's health and reproductive health in particular center. Also does political advocacy for women's reproductive rights. In 2015, according to the U.S. government Centers for Disease Control, there were around 640,000 abortions in 2015. That's from 49 reporting areas. That's not all the reporting areas within the U.S., so there were probably a few more than that. That's 11.8 abortions per 1,000 women between 15 and 44 years, and that's 188 abortions per live birth. 91 more or less % of these were in less than or equal to 13 weeks after gestation or conception. 7.6 were between 14 and 20 weeks, so that's 98 0.7%, and 1.3 were later. Okay. So there are two main methods of abortion. One is called the abortion pill, which is actually 2 pills, mifepristone and misoprostol. This can be done up to about 10 weeks. It was first legalized in Europe in 1987 and in the US in 2000. And this can be done, doesn't need to be done in a clinic, it can be done at home. And it basically causes a miscarriage. Just to be clear, this is not the morning after pill. The morning after pill is something entirely different. It's birth control that's taken that has effects immediately after sex, or within the sort of 24 to 36 hours, and the sooner it's taken, the more effective it is. Then there's surgery. There's what's called a suction abortion, which is done between up to 14 or 16 weeks after gestation or conception, and that takes about 5 to 10 minutes in a clinic. And as it's put on the Planned Parenthood site, the pregnancy tissue is basically just vacuumed out. Later abortions, dilation and extraction, when there is more pregnancy tissue, when there's a more fully formed fetus, are more involved and take up to 20 minutes. So what's the legal situation? So right now, so let's actually back up. So at the time of the American Revolution, abortion was legal before what was called quickening. Quickening is when some sort of movement can be felt in the uterus, and that happens at around 15 to 20 weeks. So before that, abortion was legal. Before that time, before that period of the pregnancy, abortion was legal. By 1900, abortion had become a felony in all states, all abortions. In 1973, the Supreme Court decided a case called Roe versus Wade. They decided that anti-abortion laws were unconstitutional. There's no explicit right to abortion in the Constitution. However, the Ninth Amendment of the Constitution says that there are rights that aren't listed in the Constitution that people have. And so part of interpreting the Constitution, which is what the Supreme Court does, is deciding, okay, are there other rights that haven't been sort of listed here that are in some sense implicit in the document? And that decision said that yes, there's some sort of right to privacy, and that implicit in different parts of the Constitution, and that right to privacy provides a right to an abortion. In Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which was in 1992, that was Roe v. Wade was affirmed. The Supreme Court came back and said, yes, we still agree with this. Their decision was based somewhat more on equal protection, equal rights, that women need to fully participate in society. Women need to have control over their reproduction, and that includes being able to have abortions. And they found there that the regulations, that abortion can be regulated, but the regulations cannot place quote-unquote undue burden on women. So since then, many states have heavily regulated abortion ostensibly for reasons of health and so on, but also in large part just to prevent abortions. So you find things like mandatory waiting periods where you have to go to the doctor and say, I'm interested in this, and then they say, okay, you have to wait and then come back, 24, 36 hours later. There's a requirement in some states that the doctor take an ultrasound of the uterus and then show it to the person who's thinking about having an abortion. And then there's scripted counseling, sort of where the doctor has to make various claims about what the effects of abortions are. There are also restrictions on providers, and these have been popular recently in places like Louisiana and Texas, where restrictions that have been struck down that would say, oh, well, to be a doctor, you have to do that provides an abortion, you have to meet these qualifications, and then they turn out to be very difficult to meet. So there's some debate about whether or not these restrictions constitute undue burden, and in some cases the Supreme Court has said yes, they are. Just recently, in the spring of 2019, some new laws have passed. So in Georgia and Ohio, they've so-called heartbeat bills have been passed, which go back in some ways to the laws they're similar to the laws that were in place in the American Revolution, but they say once a heartbeat is detected, you can no longer have an abortion. Now, it's tricky to say what a heartbeat is exactly because, as I mentioned before, there's a certain point in which the embryo becomes a fetus and has either an organ or a precursor of an organ. So there's a precursor to the heart. Does activity in that precursor constitute a heartbeat or not? It's not clear. And then Alabama passed a law that said the only time in which a woman can have an abortion is to protect the life of the mother. Rape, no. Incest, no. Basically, the only time in which is if the pregnancy threatens the life of the mother. These laws are, under the current understanding of the Constitution, unconstitutional, very clearly so. Everyone acknowledges that. They are passed in part in an attempt to get Roe versus Wade overturned. The Supreme Court may overturn Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. There's been a change in the in the makeup of the court, so that Justice Anthony Kennedy retired early in Trump's term and was replaced by Brett Kavanaugh. And Brett Kavanaugh is much more conservative than Kennedy, and while we don't know, there's every reason to believe that Kavanaugh thinks that Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey were mistaken decisions, and there are already 4 other conservatives on the court who almost certainly agree with that. And so there's some likelihood that the Supreme Court will start to chip away at abortion rights, perhaps withdraw them entirely. Now, if that were to happen, that wouldn't make abortion illegal in the country. It would mean that states would then be able to pass laws that ban abortion, as these laws, or sort of severely restrict it, as these laws I've just been discussing do. Of course, some states would not pass such bills, and so, for example, California does not have anti-abortion-based abortion regulation. Of course, it has some medical abortion regulation, and it's very unlikely that California would then start to regulate abortion more heavily because of the state's political makeup. But it would be something that the state would be allowed to do, although it probably would not do. In other states, particularly in the South, probably lots of abortion bans or severe restrictions would be passed if Roe versus Wade or Planned Parenthood versus Casey were overturned. What's probably more likely is that without overturning them explicitly, the regulations that the Supreme Court's view on what sorts of regulations are okay will change, so that it will be possible for states to very highly regulate abortion, so that it basically becomes impossible, even though it's not officially banned in those states. So that's the background. We're actually not going to be discussing the legal issue very much, because we're going to be discussing the ethical issue, which is different. So it's one thing to say it's legal to do something, and it's another thing to say it's ethically okay to do something. Lying, for example, is ethically impermissible in many cases. It's wrong to lie, but it's legally permissible in many cases. There's some libel and slander are illegal, but in general, lie in business, so fraud is illegal. But there are lots of cases where you can lie to your friend all you want about sort of non-business related matters, and it's perfectly legal. You can lie to your enemy all you want about sort of non-business related matters, and it's not libel and slander. It's perfectly legal, but it may be ethically wrong. On the other hand, driving on the left side of the road maybe is in some broad sense ethically permissible, but it's certainly illegal. It would also be probably unethical to do it given the way the laws are, but there's nothing intrinsically wrong with driving on the left side of the road. That's what they do in the United Kingdom and in Australia, and it's fine. It works just fine. It's just a conventional choice. So more generally, we can ask, is a law ethically good or ethically bad, which means that what it's ethical to do is not fully determined by what it's legal to do. So our issue is going to be, is abortion ethically permissible? So we can ask, is abortion ethically okay? And there are various positions. So one strong pro-life position says it's very wrong to abort an embryo or a fetus of any age for any reason. A strong pro-choice position would say that it's okay to abort an embryo or a fetus of any age for any reason. And then, of course, there are lots of intermediate positions that would say it's okay to abort any embryo or a fetus of some age for some reasons, and then sort of which reasons, at which age, one can have all sorts of disagreements about that. So, and this spectrum of opinion is represented in the U.S. So we can see the legal and ethical issues are distinct because being ethically pro-life doesn't entail, you could be both ethically and pro-life and legally pro-life, but you needn't be. You could be ethically pro-life but not necessarily think abortion should be illegal. Why would that be? Well, because there are different views about what the law's purposes are. So the law has many goals. One goal is maybe to punish wrongdoing, and if you think that the central goal, the overriding goal of the law is to punish wrongdoing, and you're ethically pro-life, then you think that abortion is wrongdoing, and so you think it should be punished. But you might think, no, the goal of the law is to prevent wrongdoing, or it's to maximize utility, or something like that. And if you had those sorts of views, then you might think, well, abortion is wrong, what's the best way to decrease the number of abortions? Provide all sorts of birth control and sex education and so on, right? That's a view you could have. And you might think, oh, it would actually be, while I don't like abortions, if they're illegal, then people are still going to have them. They're just going to do them in unsafe ways, and that would actually be worse. So you might be ethically pro-life and yet not legally pro-life. Those are distinct positions. So there are lots of different there's room for lots of different opinions here. Or you might be ethically pro-life, but just think that's my view. I'm not sure if my view is right, and so I don't want other people. I don't want a law to enforce my opinion on other people when I'm not sure if I'm right. So if we look at the U.S., this is from the Pew Research Center, we find that around 25% of people think abortion should be legal in all cases, somewhat more think it should be legal in most cases, and if we think of those two groups as the pro-choice group, then we end up with over somewhere between 60 and 70% being pro-choice and thinking that abortion should be legal in at least some cases, and at least most cases. Some people then less than 25% think it should be illegal in most cases, and an even smaller percent think it should be illegal in all cases. So, and between 60 and 70%, I believe, think that Roe versus Wade should not be overturned. So there's when we look at the legal issue, people are legally pro-choice. Ethically, there's more people are pro-life than are ethically pro-life. More people are ethically pro-life than they are legally pro-life. So the opinions on this are divided by political party. So if you meet a Democrat, they're pretty likely to be pro-choice. A Republican is very likely to be pro-life. Democrats are somewhat more pro-choice than Republicans are pro-life, according to the latest data I've seen. Not that different, 65-70%. So yeah. There's a strong divide by religion. White evangelicals in particular and then also Catholics tends to be highly pro-life, other religious groups not. So you might have thought, more women than men are pro-choice, and that's true, but only tiny percent, the slightly more women than men are more pro-choice. What's interesting is that women tend to have stronger views about this issue, whatever their view may be. So women who are pro-choice are more strongly pro-choice than men who are pro-choice, and women who are pro-life are more strongly pro-life than men who are pro-life. So the debate has serious implications for women's freedom, but there are women on both sides of this issue, very much so. So here's a pro-choice argument. Each person has the right to determine what happens in, to, and with their body. Having an abortion is determining what happens in one's body, and so each woman has the right to have an abortion. This argument is valid, so we might wonder, is it sound, and in particular, are the premises true? Well, premise true is pretty clearly true, so the only question about whether or not it's sound is whether or not premise 1 is sound. And premise 1 might sound pretty good. It does seem that each person has the right to determine what happens in, to, and with their body. But things are more complicated, because this is more or less true, but I don't have the right to do anything whatsoever with my body. I can move my body around in all sorts of ways. I can wave my arms, and I can do this with my arms, but I can't do that with my arms if someone's going to get hit by me, right? My right to do things to my body depends upon what happens to other people as a result of my doing things with my body. So I don't have an unlimited right to do anything with my body. I can't, in general, use my body. I can move my body in lots of ways, but I can't move my body in general in ways that interferes with other people's rights to control their bodies. So I can't, if you in many cases, right? So hugging, it's perfectly acceptable to hug people. It's great to hug people, except when it's not, right? So there's nothing wrong with emotion, but there are situations where that would be harassment. It would be violating someone else's right to do with their body what they want to. So the question we have to ask is, does abortion interfere with another being's right to life, just as my right to use my body is limited in some ways by its interference with, by the way it interacts with other people's rights. Okay, does abortion interfere with another being's right to life? So, in general, we think that rights are limited. One person's rights have to respect another person's rights, so our rights are sort of mutually compatible, and they're balanced against one another. So we consider that on the one hand, people have a right to free speech, but also people have a right to privacy, and so legally that's recognized that there are different laws about, say, libel or slander. So basically, in the press can say, has a very wide latitude with what it says about public figures, celebrities. It has a much narrower latitude about what it says about you, because you're a private citizen. You're not a public person, I assume. And so it needs to have much more evidence if it's going to publish an article about you and say, oh, you did this, that, or the other thing. And that's because the press has a right to free speech, but you have a right to privacy, and they're balanced. Again, if we consider the police, ostensibly, the police are acting we each have a right to physical safety, and ostensibly, supposedly, the police are acting to protect that right. Are they? In all cases, no, but in lots of cases, they are. We also have a right to liberty to decide what happens with our body and with our possessions. Okay, so those come into conflict, because you might think, well, in order to protect our right to safety, the police sometimes are going to interfere with people's rights to liberty, right? That's one of their sort of fundamental things that police do. How are we going to balance those rights? What's the proper balance? So when we turn to abortion, we then have to look at two issues. First of all, does an embryo or fetus have a right to life? And then secondly, if it does, what is the relationship between a woman's autonomy, the woman's right to control her body on the one hand, and the fetus's right to life that in this part of the question, we're assuming that it has, right? If it doesn't, then we don't have to get to question 2, but if it does, then we would ask question 2. How are they related? So once we recognize that there are these issues, then we need to see that a pro-choice argument that doesn't address those issues will probably fail. That doesn't mean that the pro-choice position is false by any means. It just means that a pro-choice argument needs to say something about, not only is it the case that a woman has a right, that each person, and therefore each woman, has a right to control what happens in and specifically her body, but also either there are no other competing rights or interests, or those competing rights and interests are outweighed by the woman's right to decide what happens with and in her body. So in this unit and the next, we'll be looking at an ethical pro-life position argued by Don Marquis in his paper Why Abortion is Immoral, and in the next unit we'll be looking at an ethically pro-choice position, Judith Jarvis Thompson's paper A Defense of Abortion. So that's what we'll be up to in the next 2 units, or this unit and the next.